David Whitfield had learned to read his wife the way other men read weather. 26 years did that to a person. He knew Carol's moods by the sound of cupboard doors, by how long she lingered over her coffee, by whether she hummed while she watered the porch plants, or did it in silence. So when she started coming home from the gym with her cheeks flushed pink and her eyes somewhere else entirely, he noticed. He just didn't let himself ask what it meant. "You're later than usual," he said one evening, not looking up from the paper. "Class ran long." Carol set her bag down by the door, carefully, the way you'd set down something that might spill. Blake added an extra circuit. "Blake. The trainer. I've mentioned him." She had. "In passing, the way you mention weather or traffic. Blake thinks I should increase my weights. Blake says my form's improved." David had pictured someone in his 20s, forgettable, the kind of name that came and went with a gym membership. He hadn't pictured this, his wife standing in their kitchen glowing like a woman with a secret. That night he lay awake beside her, listening to her breathing even out into sleep, and let himself think the thought he'd been keeping at a distance for weeks. Something is different. Not wrong, exactly. Different. Carol laughed easier lately. She'd bought a dress she hadn't asked his opinion on. Small things. The kind of things a man could explain away one at a time. And had been. He stopped explaining them away 3 days later. Her phone buzzed on the counter while she was in the shower, and David, who had never in 26 years looked through his wife's phone, who believed on principle that a marriage without that kind of trust wasn't a marriage at all, looked. Same time tomorrow? Can't stop thinking about this morning. He set the phone down exactly where it had been. His hand was steady. That surprised him. Carol came out of the shower, toweling her hair, humming. "Good class?" he asked. "The usual." She caught his eye in the mirror, held it half a second too long, then looked away. "Why?" "No reason." David smiled at her, and it cost him more than he expected. "Just making conversation." He waited until she left for work the next morning before he drove to the gym. It was called Ironclad Fitness, a squat brick building off Route 9 that he'd passed 1,000 times without a second glance. He sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before he went in, telling himself he was still deciding. He wasn't. He'd decided the moment he read that text. The front desk girl barely looked up. "Here for a tour or—" "I'm looking for Blake. He trains my wife." Something crossed her face. Quick. Gone before he could name it. "He's got a client right now. Should be done in 20. David nodded and found a bench near the free weights, where he could see the training floor without looking like he was watching it. He didn't have to wait long to pick Blake out. Late 30s, built the way trainers are built for the benefit of people paying to feel inadequate, laughing with a client in a way that seemed to fill the whole room. He watched Blake's hand rest on a woman's lower back to correct her form. Casual. Practiced. David wondered how many times that same hand had rested on Carol's back, and whether it had ever needed correcting for anything else. He didn't approach. Not yet. He told himself it was because he needed more than a text message and a feeling. He needed to be certain before he said something he couldn't unsay. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that some part of him, standing in that gym, watching another man laugh with his wife's trainer's easy confidence, was already doing the math on what he owed the world back. His eyes drifted across the floor to a woman stretching near the mirrors. Dark ponytail, engagement ring catching the light, waiting for someone. A moment later, Blake jogged over, kissed her cheek, said something that made her laugh. His. David didn't need to ask the front desk girl to know it. It was written all over the way Blake touched her. Easy, entitled, the same way he probably touched Carol. David left before either of them could notice him standing there. He sat in his car outside Ironclad Fitness for a long time, keys in his lap, not turning the engine over. He didn't have a plan yet, but he had a name now. Renee. He'd catch it a few days later from a conversation at the desk, and a face, and a strange, cold clarity settling into his chest where the shock had been. Whatever came next, he thought, someone else was about to feel exactly what he was feeling right now. Sleep didn't come that night, or the one after. David lay next to Carol in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan, turning its slow, useless circles, running the same 3 sentences through his mind on a loop. Can't stop thinking about this morning. Same time tomorrow. He'd read that text maybe 200 times now, in his memory, each time hoping it would soften into something innocent. It never did. Carol slept easily beside him. That was its own kind of wound, that she could rest so well with this sitting inside her. He thought about confronting her outright, sitting her down at the kitchen table the way people did in movies, phone held up as evidence, demanding the truth. He rehearsed it in his head a dozen times. Each time, it ended the same way, with Carol crying, or worse, not crying, just going quiet, and still in the way she got when she'd already made peace with something he hadn't caught up to yet. What if she's already decided, he thought, and I'm the only one who doesn't know it yet? That thought scared him more than the text had. By the 3rd sleepless night, something in him had shifted from wounded to deliberate. He wasn't a man who acted on impulse, never had been, not once in 54 years, and some old, stubborn part of him kept insisting there had to be a right way to handle this, a dignified way. But dignity hadn't stopped Carol. Why should it stop him? He went back to the gym twice that week, telling himself each time he was only gathering information, only trying to understand what he was dealing with before he did anything rash. Both times he found reasons to linger near the desk, to let names slip into conversation, to watch Blake work the floor with that easy, borrowed confidence. And both times, his eyes found Renee. She trained there most mornings, running the treadmill with the kind of discipline that looked almost peaceful. Headphones in, world shut out. David learned, without really meaning to, that she and Blake had been together 3 years, engaged since spring. The front desk girl mentioned a wedding date, sometime in October, like it was nothing. She has no idea, David thought, watching Renee towel off after a run, laughing at something a friend said. No idea at all. He told himself at first that the thought forming in his mind was really about fairness. Blake had taken something from him, without a second thought, for what it would cost. Didn't it seem right, in some basic, ancient way, that he should learn what that cost felt like? He turned the idea over for 2 more days, testing its edges, looking for the flaw in it. He didn't find one he was willing to admit to. On the 4th night, Carol came to bed smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't his, and something in David went very quiet and very cold. "Good day?" he asked, because he always asked, because 26 years of habit didn't just switch off. "Long one." She kissed his cheek, already half asleep before her head hit the pillow. "You're sweet for waiting up." He watched her sleep for a long time after that, and somewhere in the watching, the decision that had been circling him for a week finally landed. He wasn't going to shout. He wasn't going to beg her to explain herself, or threaten Blake, or do anything Carol could later describe to someone as him losing control. He was going to do something quieter than that, something that would put a name to what she'd done, without him ever having to say the word out loud. He drove to the gym the next morning before his shift, earlier than either of the trainers usually started. Renee was already there, alone in the corner by the mirrors, stretching before her run, sunlight cutting across the floor in long gold bars. David stood in the doorway a moment, feeling the old, dignified part of himself protest one last time, quietly, weakly, already losing. Then he stepped inside. Renee looked up when the door swung shut behind him, polite recognition crossing her face. She'd seen him around, maybe knew he was someone's husband. Nothing more than that. "Morning," she said, pulling one arm across her chest in a stretch. "You're here early." "Needed to clear my head." David's voice came out steadier than he felt. "Is Blake around?" "Should be in soon." She checked her phone, frowned slightly. "You need him for something?" "Something like that." He didn't have to wait long. Blake came through the back entrance a few minutes later, gym bag over one shoulder, already mid-conversation with someone on his phone, until he saw David standing near the mirrors, and stopped. "Can I help you with something?" Blake's voice had gone careful, the practiced calm of a man used to smoothing things over. "You've been helping my wife for months," David said. "I thought it was time I came by and thanked you properly." The words landed exactly where he meant them to. Blake's jaw tightened. Renee's eyes moved between the two men, confusion sharpening into something wary. "David," Blake started. "Whitfield," David said. "Carol's husband," in case that context was missing. The room had gone very quiet. A few early clients on the far side of the floor had stopped pretending not to listen. "I don't know what you think you know," Blake said, low, "but you should watch how you—" "I know enough." David's heart was hammering now, but his voice stayed level, almost calm, which frightened him more than losing control would have. "I know same time tomorrow. I know can't stop thinking about this morning. I know a lot more than I'd like to." Blake's face changed, the practiced calm slipping for just a second into something closer to guilt. Renee went very still beside him. "Blake, what is he talking about?" "Nothing. He's got this wrong." Blake reached for her arm. "Renee, don't." That was the moment something in David simply gave way. Not a decision so much as a door that had already been unlocked for days, swinging open on its own weight. He crossed the floor before he'd fully decided to. Renee's eyes went wide with confusion, one hand coming up instinctively, not understanding yet what was happening. And then David kissed her. It lasted only a second, long enough for the room to go silent, long enough for Blake's shout of her name to die for halfway out of his throat, long enough for David to feel, underneath the anger, something hollow and wrong opening up in his chest that had nothing to do with victory. Renee shoved him back, hard, her palm cracking across his face a half-second later. "What is wrong with you?" "David!" Blake was already moving, fists clenched, and only the front desk girl's shout, "Blake, don't! Security's coming!" stopped him from closing the distance. David stood there in the ringing silence, his cheek stinging. Renee staring at him with an expression he'd remember for the rest of his life. Not anger, not yet. Just pure, uncomprehending betrayal. The look of someone who'd done nothing to deserve what had just happened to her. "You don't even know me," she said, voice shaking. "You don't know anything about me." She was right. That was the part he hadn't let himself think about, standing in the parking lot with his careful, dignified plan. He'd been so certain this was between him and Blake. An eye for an eye, a debt collected. He hadn't once, not really, thought about what it would cost the woman standing in the middle of it. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it, and knew already it wasn't close to enough. He walked out past the desk, past the small crowd of stunned regulars, out into the parking lot, where the morning sun felt suddenly too bright, too ordinary for what he'd just done. He sat in his car for a long time, hands on the wheel, not turning the key. He had wanted, for 1 week, to make someone else feel what he felt. He hadn't expected it to feel like this, hollow, and already too late to take back. By the time David got home, his phone had already buzzed 4 times. He didn't need to look to know what it would say. Small towns, small gyms, word moved fast, and ironclad fitness had a regular morning crowd that knew Carol Whitfield by name. He was still standing in the kitchen, phone in hand, when Carol's car pulled into the driveway 40 minutes early. She came through the door, already crying, mascara streaked, and for one disorienting second, David thought, "She knows what I found. She's here to confess," before he understood, from the look on her face, that she wasn't crying about herself at all. "Tell me it isn't true," Carol said. "Tell me you didn't do that to her." Her, not to Blake, not because of me. Carol's first thought, even now, was for Renee. And something about that told David everything he needed to know about how badly he'd miscalculated. "Carol, Sherry called me. She said you walked in and kissed her, in front of everyone, in front of Blake." Carol's voice cracked. "David, that woman didn't do anything to you. She's engaged to the man who's been sleeping with my wife." The words came out sharper than he meant them, a last weak attempt to hold on to the righteousness that had felt so solid a week ago. "I don't see how that makes her innocent." "It makes her exactly that." Carol wiped her face, hard, angry now instead of ashamed. "You wanted to hurt Blake. Fine. God knows I gave you reason to want to. But you didn't hurt Blake this morning. You hurt a woman who never did one thing to either of us." David opened his mouth to argue and found, for the first time since he'd read that text 11 days ago, that he had nothing left to say in his own defense. Because she was right. He'd told himself for a week that this was about fairness, about balance, about making sure Blake understood the weight of what he'd taken. But standing in that gym, watching Renee's face crumple with a hurt she'd done nothing to earn, David had known, instantly, sickeningly, that he hadn't leveled anything. He'd just made a second person suffer for something that was never hers to carry. "I don't know who you were this morning," Carol said quietly. "That wasn't you." "Maybe it was," David said. "Maybe it's who I've been this whole time, and I just never had a reason to find out." They stood in the kitchen a long time after that, not speaking, the space between them heavier than either of their affairs, hers of the heart, his of 5 reckless seconds, had any right to make it. That evening, David drove back to the gym one more time, though every instinct told him to stay away. He waited in the parking lot until he saw Renee leaving, gym bag over her shoulder, eyes rimtwed. Even from a distance, he got out of the car. She saw him and stopped, wary, one hand tightening on her bag strap like she might need it as a weapon. "I'm not here to explain myself," David said. "There's no explanation that makes this okay. I needed you to hear that I know that. What I did to you had nothing to do with you, and that doesn't make it better. It makes it worse." Renee studied him for a long moment, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You used me," she said, "to say something to another man. Do you understand how that feels? To find out you were never even a person in the moment, just a message." "I understand," David said, and it was the first honest thing he'd said out loud in a week. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I've earned the right to ask you for anything." She didn't answer. She got in her car and drove away, and David stood alone in the parking lot, as the sun went down, understanding for the first time what he'd actually spent that week building. Not justice, not balance, just wreckage with his own hands. He drove home to find Carol sitting on the porch steps in the dark, waiting for him. "We need to talk," she said. "Really talk, not around it." David sat down beside her, the old wood creaking under both their weight. 26 years balanced on a step that suddenly felt very narrow. "Why didn't you just ask me what was wrong?" Carol said finally, her voice small. "Before any of this, why didn't you just ask me?" David didn't have an answer for that either. Not yet. They sat on the porch steps until the streetlights came on, and for once David didn't reach for an answer, just to fill the silence. He let Carol's question sit in the air between them. Why didn't you just ask? Because he owed her that much at least. The discomfort of not rushing past it. "I think I was scared," he said finally. "If I asked, you'd have to answer, and I wasn't ready to hear it. So instead you let it sit for weeks, and then you went and did something you can't take back, to a woman who never asked to be part of any of this." "I know." "Do you?" Carol turned to look at him, and there was no anger left in her voice now, just exhaustion. "Because I keep thinking about her face. Sherry said she just stood there after, not even crying yet. Just stunned. That could have been avoided, David. All of it. If either of us had just talked instead of acted." She wasn't wrong, and David had spent enough sleepless hours by now to stop defending himself against things that were true. "I'm not going to pretend what you did with Blake doesn't matter," he said. "It does. It broke something in me I don't know how to explain. But what I did, that wasn't punishment. That was just more damage, aimed at someone who didn't deserve any of it." Carol nodded slowly, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I don't know what happens to us," she said at last. "I don't think either of us gets to skip the hard part by being sorry." "No," David agreed. "I don't think we do." He didn't ask her to choose that night. He didn't ask her to promise anything. Some part of him, the part that had spent a week convinced he could fix a wound by making someone else bleed, finally understood that trust wasn't something you could force back into place with an ultimatum. It had to be rebuilt slower than that, or not at all. 2 days later, he went back to see Renee one more time. Not at the gym, but at the coffee shop 2 doors down, where he'd learned from a mutual acquaintance she sometimes worked in the mornings now, having quit Ironclad altogether. "I'm not here to ask you to forgive me," he said again, standing awkwardly by her table. "I just wanted you to know the wedding invitation, if there's still going to be one. It won't have anything to do with what I did. That's between you and Blake. I hope whatever you decide, it's because it's right for you, not because of the mess I made." Renee studied him for a long moment. "That's the first thing you've said to me that wasn't really about you," she said quietly. "Thank you for that, at least." It wasn't forgiveness. David hadn't expected it to be. But it was something honest passed between 2 people who'd been strangers a week ago and were now, unavoidably, part of each other's story. At home, he found Carol in the kitchen, the same kitchen where this had all started with a phone left buzzing on the counter. She looked up when he came in, and for the first time in weeks, neither of them looked away. "I don't want a version of us that just goes back to how it was," David said. "I want to know why you needed something I wasn't giving you, and I want you to know why I thought the only way to be a man about this was to hurt someone else instead of talking to you." Carol's eyes filled, but she nodded. "Okay," she said. "Then let's start there." It wasn't an ending, not really. No clean resolution, no guarantee. Just 2 people finally willing to sit in the wreckage together and ask honest questions instead of running from them. Or worse, making someone else pay for the asking. David understood, finally, that the man he wanted to be wasn't the one who evened the score. It was the one still willing to show up the next morning, and the one after that, and try again.